Hello and welcome to Fireside Chats with me, Dr. Peters. I was born and raised in New Hampshire and I completed my PhD at the University of Glasgow. My research looks at the intellectual history of the US Constitution and how that history, philosophy, political theory, and constitutional law can help us better understand and address contemporary social and political issues. This week, I'd like to chat about the war in Iran and the lack of any kind of coherent explanation or justification by the current administration for why we're at war. Now, as always, we're going to look at this current event through the lens of the founders, and particularly their views on international law, international relations, and the international community more broadly. And it will come as no surprise that among the founders we'll be looking at is James Wilson, and particularly his idea of the law of nations and how it can help us see what's going on from a different and hopefully helpful perspective. Now, generally, the founders aspired to international law. As we discussed in a previous chat, which I'll link in the description, the Constitution was inspired by international pressures. It was, in effect, a collective security agreement that had an overarching legal structure, which the founders saw as crucially important because that overarching legal structure allowed nations, and in this case, the states, to resolve their disputes through avenues short of war. We could settle disputes with lawyers instead of soldiers and bullets. This is something that the American founders hoped that they could create. They also recognized that it allowed for a collaboration, stability, and thus prosperity that would make the United States stronger. United we stand was the idea that helped get the U.S. Constitution ratified and, in part, inspired its drafting. Now, some founders, and Wilson in particular, envisioned what today we would call international law, and he even theorized something akin to the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, which is often referred to as the World Court, a place where nations can come together and settle their disputes through legal argumentation rather than military tactics. They wanted a more peaceful world, and part of that was that they hoped the United States would inspire other nations to attempt their own experiments in democratic self-governance, believing that the more democratic governments we had within the Society of Nations, the international community, the easier it would be to realize this vision of international law, a more peaceful, stable, and collaborative world that would provide more prosperity for everyone. Now, the foundation for Wilson's theorizing of international law and the ICJ is what he calls the law of nations. Now, according to Wilson, the law of nations is the natural law applied to nation states. Now, the natural law, at least in the 18th century, is the law that is innate to human beings. It's part of our Constitution, and it applies to interactions between individual human beings, and it allows the organization and functioning of society. It provides the rules and limitations that allow us to interact in a community and allow that community to function relatively well. Whereas the law of nations applies to interactions between nation states. The law of nations organizes and orders the society of nations, as Wilson labels it, or what today we call the international community. Now, Wilson sees the natural law as the basis and guiding light for good governance. Similarly, the law of nations would serve as a foundation for international law that would better help countries and nations live together in peace and harmony in their own international society or community. In natural law, we get the idea of natural or inalienable rights as they're described in the Declaration of Independence. For instance, life, liberty, and property. These are perfect rights and prohibitions. They're lines that can't be crossed or infringed upon. You can't attempt to harm me, and I can't attempt to harm you. As the libertarians amongst us would say, the rights of my fist end at the tip of your nose. Now, if we were going to apply this natural law to the Society of Nations, we might get things like respecting another nation's sovereignty, respecting their territorial integrity, and respecting their political independence. So this would mean no aggressive wars, looking to claim or seize resources, or regime change. Other nations are sovereign and independent and allowed to be. Now, is often the case, Wilson goes a step further. As we discussed in an earlier chat, which I'll again link in the description, Wilson held that there was this thing called imperfect rights, where perfect rights were a prohibition concerning what other people could or couldn't do, where that line was imperfect rights required the community to render some good to another. Wilson also believed that there were imperfect rights that existed within the law of nations. And this makes sense because, again, for Wilson, the law of nations is simply natural law reapplied to nation states. And because I think the quote is powerful and important, I'm going to read it to you. So concerning the law of nations, Wilson asserted that, and I quote, one nation ought to give to another not only the assistance necessary to its preservation, but that also which is necessary to its perfection, whenever it is wanted and whenever consistently with other superior duties it can be given. So Wilson asserted that it was a duty in the law of nations that nations should not only help each other in times of emergency to preserve their existence, but also to reach their own perfection. Not our idea of their perfection, but their idea of their perfection. Because remember, Wilson is radically democratic. It's about self-determination. It's about a people deciding who they want to be and how they want to be governed. So with that perspective and vision in place, let's look at what international law actually looks like today. Now, normally we see the UN Charter as the foundation for international law and the current global order. And very similar to Wilson's conception of the law of nations, the UN Charter prohibits the threat or use of force in international relations. Now, there are some caveats. You can use force, according to the UN, if it's in self-defense. There's also provisions for it to be passed by the UN Security Council. They can authorize the use of force, and this is normally done to stop people who are breaking that prohibition on aggressive wars. So there's this democratic element to it, that there needs to be a mandate and consensus among the community that we should use force. Now, in July of 1945, the US Senate ratifies the UN Charter, and that means that the UN Charter is not only international law, but US law and the supreme law of the land. And even before this ratification of the UN Charter, the US Constitution itself demands a democratic mandate and consensus. It states clearly that only the US Congress can declare war, not the president. This aligned with the general spirit of the US Constitution, which we discussed in the first chat of this channel, where we recognize that we the people, in general terms, means we get to decide. And the founders saw that it was very important, not only theoretically, but pragmatically, that there was a consensus among the American people that we should go to war, because without the support of the people, how could a war ever be won? Now, some commentators will also point to the War Powers Resolution from the 1970s and how it's been updated through the years. Now, even the War Powers Resolution requires that the president, upon using force, has 48 hours to inform Congress, so something of a democratic mandate, and they have to explain and justify why they used force. Now, one of the things that can justify a use of force is an imminent threat. So the US president is supposed to come to Congress and say, hey, look, guys, there was an imminent threat and I responded like this. This is democratic oversight of the executive branch, or at least supposed to be. So we can see that these generally align with the principles and ideas of Wilson and the founder on international law and war. Essentially, you can't just start a war. for the sake of it. There has to be a justification and an explanation, normally that includes self-defense or an immediate threat, and there has to be a democratic mandate or a consensus, or at least a democratic oversight to allow for this war to proceed. Now, we have all these criteria because war is awful. As William Tecumseh Sherman said, war is hell. On the second that we begin to forget that, we too easily rush into it. So with that, is this current war with Iran legal or justified according to U.S. and/or international law? In short, in my opinion, no. The administration has failed to give anything approaching a coherent explanation or justification that aligns with the requirements of international or U.S. law. Now, granted, Congress did not use their oversight power to inhibit the current administration from continuing to prosecute this war, but that doesn't make it justified. First, it's clearly not a defensive war. The administration claimed to have destroyed Iran's capabilities of attacking the U.S. homeland, particularly their nuclear program. So that's supposed to not be a threat anymore. Most of what appears to be the reliable intelligence saw that there was no imminent threat from Iran, that they likely did not even have the capability of attacking the U.S. homeland. And moreover, we were in the midst of negotiations with Iran when these attacks were launched. Now, does it have that democratic mandate, whether the Security Council, the U.S. Congress, or more importantly, the people of the United States? Have they given their authorization, whether tacitly or explicitly, to say, hey, we think we should go to war? Well, the Security Council has not voted nor authorized this use of force. I don't believe that the United States even asked. The U.S. Congress has shirked their oversight responsibility, but they certainly have not issued or voted on a formal declaration of war. But I think most importantly, the American people, as far as I'm concerned, do not want this war. The current administration ran on an anti-war platform. So the supporters of this administration, his base, didn't want another war. The other side also does not want this war. The polling is in. The blue team doesn't want the war either. So neither the red team nor the blue team want this war. There is no democratic mandate, consensus, or support for this war among the American people. And I would say, just looking at the spirit of the U.S. Constitution and the very idea of democracy, that means this war at the very least is illegitimate, and moreover, given the other criteria, I would say illegal and unjustified. So why does that matter? Well, I think most telling for domestic politics and the current state of this nation, the current administration's failure to really even attempt to justify or explain this war is a glaring warning sign that they see themselves as an authoritarian regime. In a democracy, a president has to get the people on side. They need a democratic mandate. They need support. They need to at least appear to be following the laws because they recognize that the laws apply to them as well. By not offering an explanation or trying to justify their actions as in accordance with international and U.S. law, this administration is essentially saying, the rules don't apply to us, and we don't care what the American people think. We don't care what our subjects think. We will dictate to them, and they will obey. That's not democracy. It's not liberty. That's authoritarianism. That's how dictators act. Now, not only is this a threat of authoritarianism at home, it also makes us less safe. So as we discussed, international law, according to the founders and according to many people today, makes the world a safer, more stable place. It allows for disputes to be settled through law rather than wars. When we undermine international law, such as starting an unprovoked chosen war, which, importantly as a side note, is kind of the definition of what the UN is prohibiting in Article 2, Section 4 of the UN Charter, we effectively undermine it. If the rules don't apply to us, then who do they apply to? Who should follow international law? If international law only puts you at a disadvantage as a nation, then why should you follow it? This all serves to make war more likely and to become, instead of a last resort, more of a default. And we can see this difference in the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Now, the Bush administration falsified evidence and just blatantly lied to the American people and the international community to justify their invasion of Iraq. Now, that is awful and bad, but at least they recognized the importance of international law and at least uphold appearances that they were trying to follow it, because they recognized that international law helped keep them safe and empowered the United States. They also recognized that the American people needed that justification to continue to support it, because they recognized that this is a democracy and that they would be facing elections in 2 to 4 years, and that if they lied, they would be held accountable. When the current administration doesn't even bother to lie and try to justify, they're saying international law doesn't matter and doesn't apply to them, nor is this even a democracy anymore. It doesn't matter what we, the people, think. And that's a chilling thought. Now, beyond these more principled concerns, it also makes the threat of real violence in the United States higher. The term that is often used is blowback. What blowback looks like is normally another country intervenes or meddles in the domestic politics of another country. This destabilizes the country and allows more radical elements within the population to gain power in the vacuum that is formed by the destabilization of the current government and country generally. And then the blowback comes when that radical group then takes out their frustrations on the United States, normally through terrorism. So we can see this with Afghanistan. The United States trains, supports, and supplies the Mujahideen to fight against the Soviets who are invading them. The country is essentially left in ruins, the region is destabilized, and Al-Qaeda, a more radical and more anti-American organization, takes power. These are the people that would eventually perpetrate the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which the 9/11 Commission describes as blowback. Now, we then fight a 20-year war with Al-Qaeda and then the Taliban, who replaces them, which is a more radical, more repressive, and more anti-American regime. And we can see this historically with our interactions with Iran. Iran was beginning its experiment in liberal democracy. However, the people of Iran did not want to share, or more aptly, give their oil to US and British companies. So the Americans and the Brits overthrew the democratic government and placed the Shah in power. The Shah ruled over the people. He was a more liberal, Western-looking leader, but nonetheless a dictator. The people became frustrated, and there were different groups. There were intellectual, secular groups of Iranians who wanted to restore the liberal democracy they had before. However, during the Shah's reign, the repression also gave rise to religious fundamentalists who organized and gained power. And when the revolution finally occurred, with both of these groups and many others fighting to overthrow the Shah, it was the religious fundamentalists who gained power in the vacuum. These fundamentalists installed the current cruel, repressive, and anti-American regime. And so we can see where the potential blowback is coming from. Now we've commenced a war with them to again destabilize their country and overthrow the current regime. And the question then is, who will come to fill the power vacuum that is created. The worst case scenario is that somebody worse comes to power. Historically, that seems to be the most likely outcome from another attempted regime change. Now, what this history I think also suggests or illustrates is that the founders' vision and Wilson's conception of the law of nations is not as idealistic as it seems, that it actually might be quite effective and pragmatic. So the founders envisioned the United States as a city on a hill, inspiring other peoples to try to create their own democracies. And Wilson believed that the law of nations required the nations should support each other in not only their own preservation, but to realize their own perfection. This goal and ideal of collaboration under law. Now, if we had followed these ideals when Iran was a burgeoning democracy, and we supported them in their goal of reaching their own perfection, of realizing what they wanted to be as a people and how they wanted to govern themselves, we might not be in this mess. We might have a great friend and ally rather than a war on a people that chant death to America. So maybe Wilson's idealism isn't so idealistic, but actually very pragmatic and effective if we have the courage to try it. So again, we're given a decision about who we want to be as a people and how we want to govern ourselves. Do we want liberty, or are we okay with tyranny? Do we want to be governed by laws, both at home and in our interactions with other nations? Or are we okay with dictates, force, and war? Do we want to be the kind of people, the nation, that supports and collaborates with other nations and encourages them to reach their own perfection? Do we want to be the good guys again? Or are we okay with being the international bully? And neither I nor anyone else I've seen is arguing that the Iranian regime is anything but cruel and repressive, but that this is not going to accomplish anything good for the Iranian people or for us here at home. So with those consequences and potential avenues, what will you? What will we decide? How do we want to govern ourselves? And what kind of a people do we want to be on the international stage? Do we want to inspire and collaborate, or intimidate and threaten? The choice is still ours. That's still what we the people means. And for now, I'll leave you to ponder that. As always, I hope you found this interesting, informative, and helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. And if you'd like more content like this, feel free to subscribe to the Substack or YouTube channel, or both, and you'll get weekly reminders when I put out new essays and videos. And with that, thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.